and expensive. Please support H.R. 2728. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Colorado yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee and someone who is as expert as anyone in this chamber on oil and gas industry and regulations.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members, and thank my colleague. Although I have to admit sometimes I feel a little awkward listening to my colleague's statements, and I'm glad that report showed Texas is one of the more tougher states that regulate hydraulic fracking. The state of Texas and hydraulic fracking has been a common practice for many years. The technique combined with horizontal drilling has made the idea of energy independence in the United States almost a reality. Across the United States, the development of natural gas continues to power our economic engine and is the foundation of our manufacturing renaissance. Thus far, state agencies have done a great job of regulating hydraulic fracking practices on state and private lands. In Texas, the Railroad Commission, unappropriately named, has set a variety of standards that aim to protect the environment and allow for the development of this vital natural resource. I'm a firm believer in property rights, and whoever owns the land should have the right to regulate that land. I would not support the federal government regulating the development of natural gas or the practice of hydraulic fracking on state or private lands. More importantly, I cannot support the idea or legislation that would prevent the federal government from regulating federal lands. Unfortunately, that's what this bill is asking us to do. I understand and support the desire to develop our natural resources in the most economical way possible with as little bureaucratic red tape as possible. I know the significant advantages the shale gas boom has provided our domestic petrochemical industry, various manufacturers, and a host of end users. Let's make sure, though, that the Department of Interior does their job and not have to transfer oversight of federal lands to a state land. We need the Department of Interior to allow resource development under federal law. And I encourage my colleagues to oppose this bill, and hopefully we'll bring up a bill that will make the Department of Interior actually let us produce on our federal lands. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Washington is
Mr. Speaker, I yield 30 seconds to the sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Flores.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, is recognized for 30 seconds.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm disappointed in my good friend from Texas' comments, especially in light of the fact that there's a significant number of jobs in his district and in Texas that are powered by natural gas that comes from the shale energy revolution. My friend from Texas undoubtedly knows that the federal government takes 10 times as long to issue a permit as does the state of Texas for energy activities, and I wouldn't want to have the federal government add another layer of complexity to that. Now, we're not plowing new ground with my bill. The federal government already defers to the states on the management of wildlife and water on federal lands, so I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cuellar.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Cuellar, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 2728 with my good friend Bill Flores, and of course our chairman. Also, the U.S. has become the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas, surpassing Russia this year. The transformation of our energy production has regenerated our middle class by reviving core American industries and bringing the blue-collar jobs back to U.S. soil. In light of this new American energy revolution, we must ensure that we have a smarter and more focused approach to energy regulation. This legislation will prevent the Interior Department from enforcing federal rules related to hydraulic fracturing in states that already have existing oversight rules, like my state of Texas, the state of Texas and the Railroad Commission in my home state. This legislation is not about more or less regulation. This bill helps our federal government work in a smarter and more cost-effective manner. We need to enable states to regulate their own lands because they know it better and not try to create a federal one-size-fits-all approach. This bill will untangle redundant regulation in states that have created their own regulations that address well design, location, water quality, emissions, wildlife protection, and health and safety. I represent the Eagle Ford Shale area in Texas, one of the largest production areas in the United States. That shale has transformed my area, whether it's Webb County, LaSalle, Atascosa, Wilson County, McMullen County, the other counties there have been transformed about the Eagle Ford. I also worked at the state for many years as a legislator, and I understand the Railroad Commission. I understand they also do a good job. So therefore, in our state, the state of Texas has passed smart regulations by working directly with our communities, with our counties, with our industry, and is leading the state in establishing frac focus, which informs all Texans what materials are used in the fracking activities. Our state...
Gentleman's time has expired.
I'll yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
The gentleman from Washington yields the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you so much.
30 seconds.
Our state government know their lands best, and let us improve our government functions, empower states to enforce their own laws in their own lands, and continue this energy growth that we have. And with that, I thank the chairman, Mr. Bill Flores, and also the member here, Mr. Rush, to allow me to speak. So thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Mr.
Yields back the
Speaker.
balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to another member of the Resources Committee, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very grateful to my dear friend Bill Flores and to Doc Hastings, Chairman of our committee. Appreciate so much Henry Cuellar's comments. The truth is, you know, we have been working on this for a long time, and Mr. Flores has gotten it here. This is fantastic because we need jobs in America. We need more of our own energy in America, and this bill helps us do that. I've gotten into discussion with one of our colleagues across the aisle who's now down in the Senate, and I brought this up to him in previous years. Look, if a state has a regulatory body that is addressing the issue, has cleaner air, cleaner water, is doing the job, then let them do it. Let's don't add another layer of bureaucracy that takes away jobs. It slows the economy, and I am very grateful that it looks like we're going to pass a bill that creates jobs instead of these job-ending things that have been happening down the hall and down Pennsylvania Avenue. So I applaud my colleagues. I applaud my friends that support this bill. This is going to help America. Thanks so much. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I reserve my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to another member of the Resources Committee, the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Daines.
The gentleman from Montana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of H.R. 2728, the Protecting States' Rights to Promote American Energy Security Act. You see, hydraulic fracturing has been critical to the production of our rich Montana Bakken oil. And it is key not only to our state's economy, but also to unlocking a valuable source of revenue for the federal government and our state. And this helps fund our schools, it helps fund our teachers and our infrastructure in Montana. Now, Montana has smart, environmentally sensitive regulations of this process already in place. Like most Montanans, I love to hike, I love to hunt, I love to fish. We are the safeguards of the environment in Montana. We do not need bureaucrats back in Washington telling us how to protect our lands in Montana. Yet the Obama administration has put more senseless barriers in place by stiffening the federal restraint and red tape on this process. Do you realize that Montana Indian tribes face over 50% unemployment? This rule could deny our Native Americans the independence that energy development on their lands can make possible. H.R. 2728 would ensure the federal government does not get in the way of responsible energy development on tribal land and throughout Montana. Washington, D.C. needs to look more like Montana, not the other way around. The people of Montana and our country need a responsible energy plan that protects our environment and creates a better future for our kids, and that means jobs, and that means lower energy prices. I urge passage of H.R. 2728, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Montana yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey.
I continue to reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields. Gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to yield to a former member of the Natural Resources Committee, the gentleman from New Mexico, Mr. Pierce. 1 minute.
The gentleman from New Mexico is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, natural gas is revitalizing American industries. It's revitalizing the middle class. that natural gas is being produced because we do a process called hydraulic fracturing. My background is in oil and gas, and I've seen the process my whole life. I've seen new technological innovations that keep us more safe, keep the process sound, protect the well bores, and protect the water. So who would be against a process that is rebuilding American industries, that is rebuilding the job base of this country? Sand sales, you would not seem to identify with this particular process, and yet that's exactly why sand sales are soaring in the country. The production of chemicals is soaring because of the use of this process called hydraulic fracturing. It's been around for decades. New Mexico has safe drinking water, but we've also got plentiful jobs, and American consumers have lower costs of living, all because of a process. New Mexico knows how to regulate its industry. Do not.
Gentleman's recognized.
New Mexico knows how to regulate its own industry. Do not force us to live by some cookie-cutter mold that has produced an Affordable Care Act that is killing jobs across the country. Give us our freedom, and we'll protect the environment. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield myself 2 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
It's traditional and appropriate in this country that matters dealing with health and safety, clean water and clean air, are handled at the interstate level, at the federal level. But this legislation would remove all sorts of regulations, best practices that are designed to minimize the environmental impact of oil and gas legislation for Bureau of Land Management practices. They'd be gone. It gets rid of the requirements to protect sacred sites and historic properties. It would mean that you would throw out the regulation that prevents occupancy within a quarter of a mile of designated fisheries. It would remove the regulation that you can't do any of these activities in the floodplain of the Yellowstone River, and on and on. Now, my colleague a moment ago talked about the booming industry in chemicals because of fracking. Yes, that brings up an interesting point about the difference in state regulations. We would hope that you could have, that anybody in the drilling area would have access to the chemicals that are being injected into these wells under their very feet, under their homes. But if you look at what some states allow now, they allow chemicals that are confidential, proprietary, undisclosed to be used, and they number in the dozens. Let's see, we've got here oxyalkylated phenol resins. We have terpenes and terpenoids. We have quaternary amines. These are all items that are held confidentially, proprietary. And under this legislation that we're considering, a state could make sure that they are not disclosed.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, a state that is booming because of this activity. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to thank Chairman Hastings and Mr. Flourish for bringing H.R. 2728 to the floor for this opportunity. And just like to remind everybody that although they might say, why do we do this? Why is the rhetoric important? I mean, if we don't counter the kind of alternate reality that the other side often touts, people will think that that is reality. I will remind everybody in the room that the federal government and every state government has said that not one, zero, there have been 0 accidents perforating the aquifer regarding fracking, regarding hydraulic fracking, not one. People in Washington have never been to Dimock. They've never been to Renova or Tidiute or Warren in Pennsylvania. They don't know anything about these places or what happens here, but yet they want to regulate us. The people that live there are the ones that are working there, and they have the greatest stake in protecting the environment. Let me tell you what it's done for Pennsylvania. $750 million in road and infrastructure improvements since 2008, provided by the gas industry. Average income up $1,200 because of it. $1.8 billion in tax revenue generated by responsible shale development.
I give the gentleman additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
96% of the employment comes out of the Appalachian Basin. That's Pennsylvania. That's where we live. $650 savings per household per year because of it. And 232,000 jobs, associated jobs with an average pay of $83,305 a year. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, there's a list of folks of agencies that these people must comply with for every single portion of this. And I'm going to run out of time, but I'm going to run out of time just going through them, all right? The Department of Environmental Protection, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the County Conservation
Give the gentleman 15 seconds. I see he's on going on a roll.
U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, Pennsylvania Game Commission, Pennsylvania Department of Transportation, Occupational Health and Safety Administration, Susquehanna River Basin Commission, Delaware River Basin Commission, Pennsylvania Historic Museum Commission, Pennsylvania Public Utility Council, and finally, Mr. Speaker, all those chemicals that were noted on every job site are listed on a material safety data sheet required by law. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My colleagues say that there have been no cases of contamination from the fracking itself. Well, what about leakage from poorly constructed wells? What about leakage from unlined pits? Are they prepared to claim that there's never been water contamination because of this? Because that's what the Bureau of Land Management regulations and rules get at. Well construction, wastewater management, the threats to drinking water in neighboring communities. And this legislation would remove any possibility of such rules. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to another member from a energy-producing state, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We're producing more energy now than we've ever produced, and it's thanks to new technologies like hydraulic fracking that's making that happen. The Eagle Ford Shale in the district I represent has created over 400,000 jobs and roughly $2.6 billion in salaries in a 13-county area. And it's not isolated, the benefits from this. Shale's brought back rail, steel, plastics, sand, and manufacturing. And the average U.S. household's energy costs have gone way down. I've seen numbers as high as $1,200 less for energy bills. This technology isn't new. We've been using it in Texas for over 60 years. It's regulated by the Texas Railroad Commission, and they do a great job. All these people with all the scare tactics sometimes forget that when hydraulic fracking is done, it's done a mile below or 2 miles below the water table. It's safe, it's well regulated by the state, it's good for the economy, it's turning the balance of trade, it's saving us money on energy, and it's creating an economic revival in this country. We've got to let states regulate it. I urge support of this bill.
The gentleman, his time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I continue to reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, let me inquire of my friend from New Jersey if he's prepared to close. We had some further requests, but I don't see them, and sometimes they don't get their time when they don't come down here. So I just ask if he's prepared to close. I'll prepare to close.
I say to the gentleman from Washington, we're in the same situation. I was expecting a few other speakers. Not seeing them, I would be prepared to close.
I reserve my time.
Okay. Gentleman from Washington reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, here is a partial list of the federal laws, rules, and regulations that could not be enforced were this bill to become law. The Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, the Oil and Gas Operations in National Park Service units, the Oil and Gas Operations in National Wildlife Refuges, the Casing and Cementing Regulations, such as should have been applied in the Deepwater Horizon case, the wastewater management regulations, the plugging and abandonment regulations. In other words, when pits or wells are abandoned, the best management practices for oil and gas drilling on public lands, the timing limits of when operations could be conducted with least disruption to wildlife, the protections for sacred sites, historic trails, fisheries, and wetlands, and much more. It's been sold as a states' rights bill that would only block the Bureau of Land Management fracking rules, but it would strip agencies on federal lands of the authority to enforce almost every regulation on the books. Because any state that has any regulation that affects these activities means that none of these regulations could apply. They'd all be superseded by the state regulations. That's what the bill says. And as for whether there is any damage done, I would point to my friends this picture. Maybe you have a little trouble seeing it, but essentially it shows burning tap water. No, this is not a staged picture. This happened in a residence. This is methane flaming because the water is full of methane. Now, I know my colleagues will say, oh, but that's not because of fracking. There must be some other reason. There must be. Well, they haven't found it. They have blamed it on all sorts of other things, but it happens where the fracking is occurring. So it's a case where the practice has gotten ahead of the science. The practice has gotten ahead of our regulations, has gotten ahead of our understanding. And the idea to reduce regulations and understanding so that we could do it faster is preposterous. This is not the way you protect public health. This is not the way you protect public safety. It is not the way you stimulate the economy. It is false economy to proceed in disregard for the protection of the environment. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to oppose H.R. 2728. And
Gentleman, yield real quickly.
I'd be happy to
Mr. Chairman,
yield for a question from...
Mr. Chairman, if I can inquire how much time the gentleman from New Jersey has left that he's going to yield back.
The gentleman from New Jersey has 4 minutes remaining.
Now, I would advise the gentleman to reserve his time because one of our speakers came, which we didn't think was going to happen, and so I would advise the gentleman to reserve his time so he can have a time to respond.
I appreciate the advice. It's possible that some of my speakers will arrive, I urge that we vote no, but I will reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm very pleased to yield to 1 minute to the distinguished majority leader from a state who would like to do more offshore, even though we're talking onshore. But I yield 1 minute to the distinguished majority leader, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Cantor.
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Cantor, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank the gentleman from Washington. I rise today in support of the Protecting States' Rights to Promote American Energy Security Act. Over the last 10 years, America has been experiencing a shale energy boom, and because of new technology and hydraulic fracturing, the development of energy resources has been environmentally friendly. While the technology that has made this boom possible is truly impressive, I want to take a moment and focus on the impact this boom is having on hard-working middle-class families. Many of these families are living paycheck to paycheck. Many have gone years without a meaningful raise. But powering their lights or heating their homes is not an optional expense. An unexpected rise in the monthly utility bill means less money for new school clothes, the college savings account, or even a night out at the movies. That is why it's so important that we pursue policies that lower energy costs. Hydraulic fracturing is one such policy. A recent study found that absent hydraulic fracturing, a family's home energy bills and other costs for goods and services would have been $1,200 higher last year. The study concludes that continued production of our domestic energy resources could increase disposable household income, principally by lowering costs, by $800 over the next 2 years. This is the type of relief American families deserve. But lower energy costs for working families is not the only benefit of hydraulic fracturing. The same study showed that the natural gas and shale oil industry contributed over 1.7 million jobs in 2012 alone. Going forward, it's predicted to add a total of 2.5 million jobs by 2015. These are good, well-paying jobs right here in America. And for those who've been struggling to find work for months, or in some cases years, this kind of advancement in energy technology could allow these folks to find work, get back on their feet, and provide for their families. It is no coincidence that areas of our country with active domestic energy production from hydraulic fracturing are experiencing lower levels of unemployment. These benefits to working families are now under threat. They're under threat from newly proposed federal regulations by this administration that would cost our economy jobs, keep energy bills from falling, and hinder our cause to become more energy secure. State governments and local regulators have been very effective with implementing environmentally sound regulations to meet the specific geologic requirements for their states for over 60 years. This act will keep the federal government from imposing redundant regulations and needless red tape that will only raise the monthly utility bills of millions of American families and cost America new jobs. The states and local regulators should be allowed to do this job without federal interference. And I saw firsthand when I accompanied my colleague from North Dakota, Kevin Kramer, in Williston, wellheads that are being drilled. And the last thing they need in that state, in that area, are the federal regulators coming in to tell them how to drill a well. This bill is an opportunity for the House to act in a bipartisan manner and show our constituents that we're serious about creating jobs. We're serious about easing the burden of high energy costs and serious about strengthening our energy security. I want to thank all those involved and the chairman of the committee, as well as Congressman Bill Flores and the rest of Chairman Hastings' Natural Resources Committee for their hard work and dedication to this issue for working middle-class families. I also want to thank Chairman Lamar Smith and the Science Committee for their important contribution to this legislation. I urge my colleagues in the House to support this legislation, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Virginia yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from Washington.
This is Groundhog Day, Mr. Chairman. I'd ask my friend, now I have no more that I can foresee at all, and so I'm prepared to close if the gentleman doesn't repeat his last statement.
Well, then I will take just a moment.
Gentleman's recognized.
I'll reserve.
When I showed the picture of the burning tap water, I saw expressions of incredulity from the other side of the aisle. Surely that can't be true, or if it is true, surely it's not because of fracking. A Duke University study found that methane contamination was in 115 of 141 shallow residential drinking wells that they studied, 6 times higher than in wells greater than a mile from the fracking operations. Now, it's hard to tell when you're deep in the ground where that methane is leaking and what other chemicals, undisclosed chemicals, are leaking with that methane. But there's something here that should be regulated, and this legislation would prevent such regulations. I urge a no vote and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey yields back the balance of time. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have remaining?
The gentleman from Washington has 3 minutes remaining.
I yield myself the balance of the time.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the underlying bill has been mentioned several times is about American jobs and American energy security. Just last week, the International Energy Agency released its World Energy Outlook. And in that report, they predict that the U.S. would surpass Saudi Arabia and become the top oil producer in the world in only 2 more years. Now, this is great news for our economy. It's great news for American workers. It's great news for potential energy prices. And, Mr. Chairman, it's great news for our national security. Now, this recent boom in energy production would not be possible without the new technological advances of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. Let me give you an example. In the year 2000, shale gas, which is the prime area that you go after with hydraulic fracturing, provided just 1% of our nation's natural gas supplies. Today, it's 25%, and that number will only continue to grow. Now, while the White House is quick to take credit for this uptick in energy production, the truth is this increase is happening in spite of this administration's policies and not because of them. Because what has been well documented, all of the increase in energy production is happening on state and private lands, not on federal lands. Currently, 93% of shale oil wells are located on private and state lands and only 7% on federal lands. So that simply means that there's a great potential on federal lands that are currently being ignored because of the regulatory hoops. And I suggest that if the Department of Interior goes through with their regulations on fracking that would be duplicative of those states, it would only keep that 7% where it is rather than increasing. It seems to me from a standpoint of policy for our country, it's best to be as energy secure as we can possibly be, because that means that we are secure from a national security standpoint. And finally, and certainly not least, that means that American jobs, good paying American jobs, are creating the energy for the American consumer. That's what this bill is all about. I urge my colleagues to support the legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, Mr. Speaker, I yield myself 2 minutes.
The gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, each week there is more good news about the benefits of the energy revolution underway across America. Whether it's the manufacturing renaissance spurred by affordable natural gas or the new opportunities for good-paying energy jobs, the benefits of the shale revolution can hardly be overstated. For that reason, I'm happy to support H.R. 2728, a bill that seeks to prevent redundant federal regulations where states already have environmental protections in place. H.R. 2728 also incorporates legislation reported by the Science Committee, the Hydraulic Fracturing Study Improvement Act. Title II of this legislation holds the EPA accountable by requiring it to base its studies on the facts instead of worst-case scenarios that exist only in the EPA's imagination. In its zeal to regulate, the EPA has rushed to link water contamination to hydraulic fracturing. It has made this claim in 3 high-profile cases, only to be forced to retract its statements after the facts have come out. The EPA's track record does not instill confidence in their ongoing studies of the relationship between hydraulic fracturing and drinking water. The Science Committee has conducted numerous oversight hearings on EPA research. These efforts have revealed that the EPA's approach is to try to find problems without considering whether these problems would actually occur in the real world. Title II corrects this by requiring a real-world look at risk that gives an honest evaluation of probability. This will prevent the misuse of the EPA studies by those simply looking for an excuse to scare people. Title II of this legislation will enhance our ability to ensure continued safe and responsible production of America's natural energy resources. Mr. Speaker, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves. The gentlelady from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. I rise in opposition to H.R. 2728, Protecting States' Rights to Promote American Energy Security Act. Title II of this act is a bill passed by the Science Committee, the EPA Hydraulic Fracturing Study Improvement Act. This is a piece of legislation that should not have been passed out of the committee. First, Title II contains provisions that designate the fracturing study as a highly influential scientific assessment and require EPA to follow its standard peer review protocols for such assessments. This language is unnecessary because EPA already considers the fracking study to be a highly influential scientific assessment. Second, and importantly, unfortunately, this bill will obstruct EPA's ability to carry out its important work. The requirements of this bill may force the EPA to delay production of their final report on the effects of hydraulic fracturing on water quality. This bill could delay an important report that is based on a study that the EPA initiated more than 3 years ago. The study was reviewed and approved by the EPA's Independent Science Advisory Board. The Science Advisory Board found the study to be both appropriate and comprehensive. The American public should not have to wait any longer before they receive a scientific analysis of whether their water has been affected by hydraulic fracturing. What I found troubling is that the Science Committee never got information from the Science Advisory Board, which validated the study, regarding its opinion about the bill. Nor did we get comments from the EPA or any other experts. In fact, the bill never had a hearing. This bill effectively attempts to micromanage the EPA without a factual basis for doing so. The bill requires the EPA to do an ad hoc risk analysis by requiring them to quantitatively estimate the probabilities, uncertainties, and consequences of impacts to drinking water from hydraulic fracturing. However, this was never a study that was set up to determine the risk effects of hydraulic fracturing. This study was meant to examine the science to determine if hydraulic fracturing operations have any effect on groundwater. By requiring an ad hoc risk analysis on a study that was not designed to acquire the data necessary to do a risk analysis, the EPA would be forced to try to fit a round peg in a square hole. What remains truly unclear is why this language is included when it is so unnecessary. If the current study were to find a link between fracking and groundwater contamination, then a full risk assessment will be required before the agency can establish any regulations to address the issue. What this bill is doing here is requiring a risk analysis simultaneously and as part of the very study that is meant to determine if there is a need for a risk analysis. These efforts to become involved in directing the specific details of scientific process are very troubling. It appears that this bill is setting up the EPA to fail. If the EPA doesn't complete the study by the deadline, they've failed. And if the EPA completes the study but the ad hoc risk analysis is not as detailed as the bill's proponents expect, then they will have also failed. And more importantly, their ad hoc risk analysis may taint the very accurate scientific data behind that analysis. It is not in the public interest to have this study delayed any longer. Let the EPA complete their study. If the science shows the effects connecting hydraulic fracturing with contaminated groundwater, then we'll let the EPA's long-established process of doing a risk assessment after such a study be followed completely with all the I's dotted and T's crossed. It's also difficult to understand how the proponents of the bill reconcile Title II with Title I. Title I clearly attempts to prevent the federal government from having oversight, inspection, or enforcement responsibility for hydraulic fracturing regulations. However, if the states are supposed to regulate, don't they need the science to support those regulations? This study is designed to be the science that provides the federal government and the states with the information they will need to make policy choices about the effects of hydraulic fracturing on groundwater. By possibly delaying this study, we delay the ability of the states or the federal government to make prudent choices to protect the American public. If you support hydraulic fracturing, delaying the study will not speed up the process of opening new areas of the country to hydraulic fracturing. Title II of H.R. 2728 will only delay an important scientific study and ironically may delay the development of new shale fields throughout the United States. I urge my colleagues to vote against this legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from Oregon reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on the way to yielding time to the gentleman from Wyoming, I want to point out that the underlying bill, the science bill that is contained in the underlying bill, did pass by voice vote in the Science Committee. I'll now yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Wyoming, who is also the chairman of the Energy Subcommittee on the Science Committee.
The gentlelady from Wyoming is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the right of state governments to regulate hydraulic fracturing. I'm pleased that the bill before us also includes Chairman Lamar Smith's bill to ensure the integrity of federal research into hydraulic fracturing. Mr. Speaker, the EPA botched its study linking hydraulic fracturing to groundwater contamination in a 2011 report on groundwater in Pavilion, Wyoming. The report was so flawed that the EPA was forced to disavow their preliminary conclusion that hydraulic fracturing caused contamination in Pavilion. The EPA's phony preliminary conclusions were widely reported, altered national public perception, and the EPA did not back away until the damage was already done. 2 years later, the EPA turned the study over to the state of Wyoming, where it will undergo the scientific rigor it deserves. Mr. Speaker, the question today is not whether hydraulic fracturing should be regulated. It should. But we shouldn't allow the federal government to regulate when states are already stepping up to the plate. My home state of Wyoming has been a leader in hydraulic fracturing regulation, so much so that even the Bureau of Land Management holds up Wyoming as a model. What works for Wyoming might not work for Texas or Pennsylvania. The hydrology and the geology are different. Any state that assumes the responsibility of regulating hydraulic fracturing should be allowed to do so. Governors, legislators, and state regulators care about the well-being of the citizens in their state. More than that, who better to regulate the practice than those who live near the wells, who drink the groundwater, and who know the local geology, hydrology, and industries better than anyone. I urge my colleagues to support 2728 and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady's time's expired. The gentlelady from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady's recognized.
To clarify, there was opposition to the legislation in the Science Committee. However, there was no recorded vote, and I continue to reserve my time.
The gentlelady continues to reserve. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'll yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Collins, who is a member of the Science Committee.
Gentleman from New York, Mr. Collins, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to speak today. I want to speak out about the importance of the EPA Hydraulic Fracturing Study Improvement Act, legislation that makes up Title II of the Act. The EPA is currently conducting a multi-year study on the relationship between hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, and groundwater. This legislation will greatly improve the value of the EPA study by increasing transparency and requiring it to include an objective risk assessment. Hydraulic fracturing has been studied over and over again. My home state of New York is a prime example of how studies can stall job creation. In New York, a moratorium on hydraulic fracturing was enacted in 2008. Now, 5 years later, that moratorium is still in place because the New York Department of Environmental Conservation is conducting a study on the environmental impact of fracking. Yet no details of this study have been revealed, and a date of completion has yet to be announced. Now, the EPA is trying to do a similar study, which will only further delay a practice that many states currently allow and are benefiting from. Fracking represents one of the greatest opportunities for strengthening our nation's energy security and spurring economic growth. If New York would allow fracking, 520 shale gas wells would sustain over 60,000 new and needed jobs. This legislation will increase transparency and accuracy in how the EPA reports on the study of hydraulic fracturing and will get rid of the need for duplicative studies like the one being done in New York. Additionally, the risk assessment requirement will turn the study into a useful tool for both scientists and decision makers. By providing decision makers with the data and information they need in order to become comfortable with fracking, we can help create jobs and further our nation's energy independence. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlelady from Oregon is recognized.
I continue to reserve.
Gentlelady reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we're prepared to close, so I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentlelady from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2010, the Department of Interior, Environment and Related Agencies Appropriation Act required the EPA to perform a study on the relationship between hydraulic fracturing and groundwater contamination. The final report is currently expected to be released in 2016. EPA's proposed study plan was reviewed by the EPA's Science Advisory Board. The Science Advisory Board determined that EPA's approach was generally appropriate and comprehensive. Further, the Science Advisory Board recommended that some analysis of risks be considered in the study, but a full risk assessment could add another 5 to 7 years to the expected release date. The proponents of this legislation mischaracterize the EPA study plan as flawed for failing to include a comprehensive risk assessment. That position is not consistent with the conclusions of the highly qualified scientists, researchers, and industry representatives who are members of the EPA's Independent Science Advisory Board. And importantly, Title II could delay the release of this very important study. I urge my colleagues to oppose this legislation, and I yield back.
The gentlelady from Oregon yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, we actually have two more individuals who will speak on this side, so if the gentlewoman from Oregon wants to claim some time after our next speaker, she would be welcome to do so. Meanwhile, I'll yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, who is a distinguished member of the Science Committee.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Weber, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. And Mr. Speaker, Texas has produced half of all new jobs in America in recent years. Even Time magazine notices how things are good in Texas. They call it maybe the future of America. The creation of many of these jobs in Texas would not be possible without hydraulic fracturing. Fracking is reaching previously untapped shale natural gas deposits, thereby increasing our nation's natural gas supply and lowering the cost of energy for all Americans. Seemingly unaware of all of the economic benefits of America's energy renaissance, the Obama administration has moved to regulate fracking on federal lands and to spend millions of dollars in studies at the EPA, despite its safe usage in Texas for over 60 years. The EPA is 0 for 3 when it comes to hydraulic fracturing alarmism. Their allegations of groundwater contamination in Texas, Pennsylvania, and Wyoming all struck out after proper review and analysis. That's why I support H.R. 2728, because it will leave the regulation of fracking up to the states. We care about our states more than any bureaucrat up here in Washington, D.C., and one size doesn't fit all. Texas was environmentally friendly before being green was cool. This legislation also holds the EPA accountable to taxpayers by requiring that their multi-million-dollar study of hydraulic fracturing, here's a novel thought, follow basic and widely agreed upon scientific procedures. We've got it right in Texas. They ought to leave us alone, and we'll help create those jobs and get this economy moving again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. Gentleman from Oregon.
Thank you. I thank the chairman, Mr. Smith from Texas, for his offer to reclaim. I will reclaim and reserve any remaining time. Thank you.
Without objection, the gentlelady reclaims and reserves. The gentleman from
Actually,
Texas.
Mr. Speaker, we are now on our last speaker, and so if the gentlewoman wants to yield back, we can proceed.
Gentlelady from Oregon.
Okay, may I inquire whether there are other speakers?
We are on our last speaker now to respond to the gentlewoman from Oregon.
So I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from North Dakota, Mr. Kramer, also a member of the Science Committee.
The gentleman from North Dakota is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the Chairman for his leadership on this important issue. Mr. Chairman, the citizens of North Dakota sent me to Washington in large part to protect our thriving economy from the overreaching regulations, often based on faulty science, from destroying that very economy. And in carrying out that charge, I get the opportunity to tell the North Dakota success story in Washington with the hopes that we could duplicate it around our country. A major part of telling that story, of course, is talking about the successful regulation of hydraulic fracturing in our state. Lynn Helms, the director of North Dakota's Department of Mineral Resources, testified in the Natural Resources Committee on this very issue, saying that our oil and gas rules are reviewed at least every 2 years through a public comment process. That North Dakota regulations already address flowback disposal, chemical disclosure, well construction, and well bore pressure testing, and have reduced well bore failures from 6 per year to 0. From 6 to 0, that's success at the state level. In addition to the fact that any federal hydraulic fracturing rule will be duplicative, the rules will be impractical to implement across the nation where environmental and geological circumstances are as diverse as the views in this chamber. North Dakota has gone from number 9 to number 2 in oil production, and at the same time from number 38 to number 6 in economic success. And while the BLM is developing their hydraulic fracturing rules, the EPA is conducting studies on the potential impacts of hydraulic fracturing on drinking water resources. A stated goal of the EPA study is to ask the question, quote, what are possible impacts, I restate possible impacts, of hydraulic fracturing fluids on drinking water. Even the EPA's independent advisors have raised questions, with one member stating, quote, there is no quantitative risk assessment included in EPA's research effort. Despite, Mr. Chairman, no cases of hydraulic fracturing impacting drinking water resources, Title II of this bill does not prevent the EPA from conducting such studies, but ensures any such study done is held to the highest standards of review and risk assessment. I urge passage so that the federal government cannot impose its mediocrity on states' success.
The gentleman from North Dakota's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas yields back the balance of his time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendment in nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Natural Resources, printed in the bill, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of Rules Committee Print 113-27 is adopted. The bill, as amended, shall be considered as the original bill for the purpose of further amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered read. No further amendment to the bill as amended shall be in order except those printed in Part B of House Report 113-271. Each such further amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, and shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in Part B of House Report 113-271. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 1, printed in Part B of House Report Number 113-271, offered by Mr. Holt of New Jersey.
Pursuant to House Resolution 419, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself, not seeing other speakers here, 3 minutes.
Recognized.
I rise in support of the amendment that I'm introducing along with Mr. Peters and Mr. Polis to allow the Secretary of the Interior to regulate methane. Now, methane is the second most abundant greenhouse gas emitted in the United States, and the oil and gas industry is responsible for about 30% of all methane emissions into the atmosphere. Methane is a superpollutant, more than 20 times more potent than carbon dioxide in warming the atmosphere. Now, we know that methane can and sometimes does leak from fracked wells. That's what we see here with the ignited tap water. Now, this so-called fugitive methane also contributes to air pollution itself. as tropospheric ozone or smog, which threatens public health by triggering asthma attacks and aggravating the conditions of people with bronchitis and emphysema. In fact, methane leaks have contributed to the upper Green River Basin in Wyoming having some of the worst air quality in the country, at times rivaling the air quality of bad days in Los Angeles. Although discussed as a cleaner burning and more climate-friendly energy source, natural gas, which is mostly methane, leaks at every stage of the production, not just into the groundwater and hence into drinking water wells. It does leak, and it does affect the Earth's climate. And it's true that burning methane releases less carbon dioxide greenhouse gas to the atmosphere than does burning an equivalent amount of coal. But the methane itself is a greenhouse gas, and fugitive methane emissions in excess of only a few percent remove the relative advantages of natural gas compared to other fossil energy sources. Aside from issues of climate and health, leaked methane represents lost royalties for the federal government, lost revenue for oil and gas companies, and I know that supporting greater profits for big oil is something that my colleagues should be eager to support. Our amendment will help prevent the wasteful leakage of natural gas, will limit avoidable methane emissions, and will protect air quality and public health. I urge a yes vote on the Holt-Peters-Polis amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim in time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, the legislation before the House today is designed to eliminate duplicative regulations and allow for increased energy productions. That's the intent of legislation. Yet here we are with an amendment that creates a loophole in the bill to allow the government to oppose backdoor regulations to restrict and block American energy production, which of course we know would result in lost job opportunities. H.R. 2728 aims to give the states primacy in regulating hydraulic fracturing operations within their borders. I want to mention that again. This bill aims to give the states primacy in regulating hydraulic fracturing within their borders. So if a state regulatory body wants to implement emissions regulations, which this amendment addresses, in conjunction with their other rules and regulations, they are free to implement their own regulations beyond what is already required. Nothing in this bill prevents any state from putting emission at the end of it regulations in place. And further, the Secretary has the authority to manage methane emissions from production on federal lands, and working collaboratively, we have seen significant reduction in the last 2 years because of that effort. However, attempting to cloak these regulations as fracturing regulations through a loophole that will cost American jobs and inhibit energy production, in my mind, is simply not the way to go. So this amendment aims to impose controversial and political regulations into a bill that is about American energy production, and I urge a no vote. And let me just make one other point, and I'll probably repeat this again. There's nothing in this bill that prevents a state from regulating emissions within their state, which of course would take effect of what the gentleman is trying to do. So with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserved from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The whole point of the underlying bill is to make it impossible for the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Land Management, the Secretary of the Interior, to impose regulations. It says if the state has any regulations, then the federal regulations don't count. All this amendment would do would say on the important issue of what is called fugitive methane, leaked methane, methane that gets into the atmosphere by whatever means because of the drilling and fracking, should be limited. And it should be limited for several reasons. It is a potent greenhouse gas, and it is lost revenue. So I would think that everyone would be eager to make sure that none of this fugitive methane gets into the atmosphere, that it is, or into the drinking water, I might repeat. So we know methane can and sometimes does leak from fracked wells. We should want the Secretary to be able to regulate that, because under the bill, under the underlying bill, the Secretary could not. This amendment is necessary, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Washington.
I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman's recognized.
My good friend, the author of this amendment, opened his second remarks by saying this legislation makes it impossible to regulate fill in the blanks. No, Mr. Chairman, that is not the case. This bill says that primacy of regulation of hydraulic fracturing, which has been going on for some 60 years, if a state has it in place, that state's laws shall be the one that we should follow. Those states that don't have it, then of course this legislation would allow the Department of Interior's regulations to be there until they change their regulations. But I want to make a point. This amendment is about emissions from the process of hydraulic fracturing. Nothing in this bill, as I said before, prevents a state from doing what they can do. After all, keep in mind, Mr. Chairman, those states that have hydraulic fracturing rules maybe in all likelihood have some regulations dealing with the emissions that come from that. Nothing in this bill prevents that from happening. What the amendment does do, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, is a backdoor way to regulate hydraulic fracturing when, as I said just a moment ago, has been done successfully for over 60 years in the states. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed.
Mr. Chairman, on that I ask a recorded